Today in the Spare Tech Room, we're going to be building the best possible kind of brand new PC for around 500 bucks. Now, if you've been following my channel at all, you know I just built myself an incredible PC for gaming and for editing these videos. So you might be wondering why I'm wasting my time building a PC that's less powerful than the one I already have. Well, let me try to explain. So for those that don't know, I just built a new mini RTX build with a Ryzen 7800 X3D, 64 gigs of RAM, and I threw in my RTX 3080. If you want to see that full build, I'll link to it up here somewhere and then at the end of the video. But after building that, I still had a lot of parts left over from my previous build. So I was trying to figure out what to do with those. And it turns out my girlfriend's godson has a big birthday coming up and the kid loves playing Minecraft especially. So I got together with his parents, I told them I had some PC parts that we could use and they picked up the rest. And so we decided to put together a pretty solid gaming PC, spending no more than 500 bucks on it. So what I'll do now is I'll walk you through all the parts I have here and then I will show you kind of a top-down build process of the entire thing. And then we'll come back here to wrap the whole thing up. So you can probably see on the side of the video here, I have what looks like a giant case. I promise it's not as big as it looks on camera. Now, this is the NZXT H5 Flow, which I really like, especially in the white. And I'll show you a little bit more about this case when we get to the top-down view. But in short, it's a good ATX size, mid-size tower with a lot of airflow. And of course, working with a $500 PC, you're not gonna need a ton of airflow because the parts that we're putting in here aren't going to be incredibly powerful, but it's always good to have some extra space and some extra airflow. And you can get it for a really good price right now. I'll actually list all of these parts in the description box below with the best possible pricing that I can find. So if you wanna jump down there and check any of that out, you totally can. So of course, we have our case, which should work for just about any mid-size ATX build. In that case, and I'll start kind of at the bottom of this pile, we have a B450 Tomahawk motherboard. Now, this is a pretty solid Ryzen motherboard that will work with Ryzen, the 3rd generation, and I believe 4th generation Ryzen CPUs. So we've got that motherboard. It's served me very well. The only thing I don't like about this motherboard is that it does not have a front USB-C header, and this case does have USB-C connectivity on the front. So I'll try to find another motherboard in the same price range that has a USB-C connection for the front of the case, and I'll link to that in the description box below. But this is what I had in my prior build, so this is one we're gonna go with. Just any reasonable B450 motherboard should be totally fine though. So we've got that. Now attached to that motherboard, we're gonna go with my Ryzen 3600, Ryzen 5 3600. And again, this is a 3rd generation Ryzen CPU, which is going to work perfectly with this motherboard. You can get a 3600 or the 5600 is another really good get if you can get that for a similar price. Either one of those are going to be fantastic for gaming, especially, and even for video editing. I was doing all of my video editing for this channel and my previous channel on this PC, basically. So the Ryzen 3600 or 5600, if you can find it for the same price, are going to be excellent options for anybody who's trying to do both gaming and maybe a little bit of like production work. So we've got that. We also have here 16 gigs of DDR4 3200 Corsair Vengeance RAM. This should be totally fine for a build around $500. I have, as I mentioned earlier, 64 gigs in my new PC build, but that's going to be total overkill for a setup like this. If you can spring for 32 gigs, it can't hurt to kind of future-proof you a little bit, but 16 should be fine for now, and you can always upgrade down the road. And Corsair Vengeance RAM is just tried and true. You can never really go wrong with this kind of RAM. So we've got that. And then we also have the GPU here. Before we get into that, though, I do have a 512 gigabyte NVMe SSD. I believe it's Gen 3 that I don't have on the table here, but we do have that as well. You can get those for a steal and they'll work perfectly with the B450 motherboards. If you have newer motherboards, a lot of those will work with Gen 4 NVMe SSDs, but this one works with Gen 3, so we have that. Got it for a steal. Again, I'll link to that in the description box below. But what you're all probably interested in is what GPU we decided to go with. Now, there are a ton of different options within a reasonable price range for a build like this, but I wanted to go with the RTX 4060, which is what we have here. It's the Zotac Gaming RTX 4060. Love Zotac with the GPUs that they do. Usually you can find them for a pretty good price and they're really good quality. So we've got the Zotac Gaming 4060 here. This is going to be a phenomenal GPU for this build. You should have a pretty balanced setup here, and this is going to give you some great frames in whatever games you're going to be playing. As I mentioned, my girlfriend's godson plays a lot of Minecraft, but as he grows and starts to pick up more games, as his parents start to let him play different games, I think this is going to serve him very well. And you should be able to game easily 1080p, high settings on most games with the GPU like this. But yeah, those are the parts that we have for this PC. Now I'm going to go ahead and jump over to the top-down view so you can watch me put it all together. You can watch me suffer and struggle as I try to put together another PC. And then we will come back here once it's all built and I'll kind of tell you how I feel about it. All right, to the top-down view. All right, so here we are. Now you have kind of a top-down view, or really a side view of the case as I have it open. A couple of things that I've already done here before I kind of started recording this portion is, one, I took off the side panel here with the glass and the opposing panel on the opposite side to kind of help with cable management and everything. Also, I've already installed the fans. I figured that would be a boring thing that you probably didn't care to see, but the case did come with a couple fans. I've got one of the case fans here on the back set to exhaust. I also installed two other fans that I picked up separately at the top to exhaust. I have two at the very front to intake air. And then one of the cool things about this particular case is it has a kind of basement fan down here as well, which is set to intake air. So we're bringing all the air in from the front and the bottom here, and then sucking it up out the top and the back. So that should create, I believe, a good airflow across the GPU and CPU to get kind of maximum cooling for this build. Now, this isn't a crazy powerful build, so it shouldn't need that much cooling, but I figured I had the fans, might as well install them. So I went ahead and hooked all those up. Also, little pro tip, if you're not sure which way is exhaust on your fans, generally there will be kind of bars that connect to the center of the fan on one side or the other. And whatever side those kind of support bars are on is the exhaust. So hopefully that helps you out if you're kind of doing this yourself and you're not quite sure which way is intake and which way is exhaust. Look for those support beams, and whatever side of the fan those are on, that is the exhaust. And generally you want to create a good airflow, kind of like what we have set up here. Now, of course, we could do different testing with different configurations for the fans to see what the optimum setup is for this particular case and this particular, CPU and GPU, but that's not really going to be necessary for a budget build like this. Really, you only have to worry about that if you have crazy powerful components in a fairly small case with not great airflow. But here, we should be totally fine. So I've got all the fans in place. Also, because we're kind of repurposing parts with this build, I already had the motherboard and the CPU with the CPU cooler installed, so I didn't want to take that apart just for the sake of taking it apart. So what we're going to do here is we are going to take the motherboard with the Ryzen CPU and the, I forget which fan this is. There's a name for it. If I can think of it, I'll post it here. But we've got that already installed. So we're just going to go ahead and take this motherboard and slot it into the case, get that screwed down, and then start connecting everything. Now, of course, before you put your motherboard into the case, you do want to make sure that you put the shield on the very back of the case. I can't really show you from this angle, but basically it's for all of the plugs on the back of the motherboard. You want to make sure that you have that shield in place so this slots into that nicely. I've definitely installed motherboards before and forgot to put that in place and then had to completely remove just about everything just to put that one silly little piece in there. So make sure you do that first. But for now, we're gonna go ahead and get this thing installed and then we'll move on to the next step. Okay, so now we've got the motherboard slotted into place. You'll want to make sure that it lines up with that shield at the very back, but also make sure that the different screw holes are lining up with the RTX screw or mounting ports on the case itself. So you just wanna make sure that's lined up correctly, wiggle it, make sure it's locked up in place there, and then we can go ahead and insert the screws to get the motherboard properly mounted to the case, and then we can start plugging things in. So let's do that next. And on this particular case, we've got 8 different points for these screws to be mounted into place. So let's go ahead and get started on that. Now you want to make sure that as you're doing this, you are not tightening them down all the way as you work your way around. You just want to kind of make sure they're loosely put in place so that way everything lines up, and then we can go around and tighten everything down. And generally, they'll recommend that you do kind of a crisscross pattern with things like this. You don't want to just work around in a circle, because then you might get to the end of that circle and realize that the opposing or the opposite side screw is slightly out of place. So work a little zigzaggy to make sure that each corner and each side is kind of properly fastened into place. And once you kind of work your way around one time so you kind of get the major corners here, you should be good to go. You just want to make sure, again, that each side and each corner is properly aligned. And again, even when you're tightening these things down, you want to make sure that you are not overly tightening them. This is not a piece of construction equipment, okay? It is a motherboard, so be gentle, make sure it's secure, but you do not need to crank these screws down. You do not want to damage the motherboard and just, be in a really rough spot. So just a word to the wise. And that is the last screw right there. This motherboard is pretty securely in place at this point. So now what we'll do is I'm going to go ahead and hook up the CPU fan to the motherboard. Then we will maybe hook up the other case fans, get the RAM installed, the M.2 hard drive, and then slot in our GPU and connect all the power supply stuff. So we are on our way. And if you're not sure where things are supposed to connect, make sure you reference your manual. But in this particular case, this is the CPU fan, and I can see right up here, we have what is labeled as the CPU fan header. So we'll go ahead and connect that to that. Pretty simple. All right, and then we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different case fans on here. And I'm pretty sure I do not have 6 fan headers on the motherboard. So we will need a splitter. So for me, I've got a couple of those fan splitters. You can see on one end, it's just kind of the typical fan plug. And on the other end, it splits out into 2. So I have 2 of those. So I should be able to turn 2 fan headers on my motherboard into 4 case fan headers. So let's go ahead and hook those up and get this all split up. Also, a pro tip here, make sure that you're keeping an eye on where all of the fan headers are on the motherboard, because when you are connecting them in different places, so for example, we have fans up at the very top, we have fans down here at the very bottom, you want to try to plug them into whatever the closest header is for those particular fans. So if I were to go ahead and plug these top fans into a fan header down at the bottom, I might be in trouble with some of the other connections. So kind of learn the lay of the land, maybe map it out for yourself so you know exactly what you're doing. Okay, and on this particular motherboard, I have one system fan header here, kind of towards the center, one at the bottom. I have 2 over on this side, and then I do have a pump fan header here as well. Now, we don't have a pump on this particular build, but that is one that we could use as well for a case fan if we need to. So for now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to connect these 2 top fans to this top fan header via this splitter. So let's go ahead and do that. And the cable management here doesn't have to be perfect by any means. We're just getting everything connected, and then we can start to kind of cable manage from that point. But for now, we just want to get everything plugged in so that way we know where everything's going and we can sort it out afterwards. So let's get these both plugged in here, and then kind of just move this to the side so it's out of the way as best we can. I'll just tuck that back here just so it's out of the way. Okay. And then we'll do the same with these front 2 fans. I'm going to connect it to what is labeled as, actually, you know what, I just realized I accidentally plugged this into the pump fan, so let me move that. This should be plugged into system fan 3. Now again, it's not going to make a huge difference if you plug that into a pump fan header, or even the CPU fan header if you want to, if it's that much of an issue to kind of get things lined up correctly. But I just, for the sake of having everything hooked up right, I'm just going to go ahead and make sure that we've got system fans going to the system fan headers and so forth. So that's good. Try to move this out the way again. Okay. And then we get the splitter to system fan 4. So we'll hook that up and then plug these both in. There we go. And we'll just tuck this off to the side here for now, again, to just kind of get that out of the way. And now we have the bottom fan and this back fan here, which both cables are going to be behind the motherboard, or behind the case itself. So let me grab those real quick and feed them through. Okay, so we've got the one for the bottom. I'm going to go ahead and hook that up over here. Actually, let me feed that through this part. Okay, so that's good to go. I apologize if the audio isn't great here. I've got the mic hooked up to my camera, so if I move off mic, you might not hear me as well. But this is all a learning experience. I'm figuring out how to do this on camera, so hopefully it's not too bad. And then we're going to grab the cable for this rear fan, and that's going to get plugged in right in here. So let's try to find a place to feed that through. It may have to come through the very top and then feed down through here. Maybe I could snake it underneath here and then plug it right in there. Okay, and that seems to be feeding through fairly well. I like that. And we'll plug that right into this last system fan header on the board. And then the rest of this cable we can kind of feed back through, and again, we'll try to just tuck that out of the way And when we cable manage at the end here, we should be able to kind of find a place to hide all that. Okay, so we've got all of our fans in place. Now, what I'm gonna go ahead and do is I'm just gonna get the M.2 into place, so that's kind of out of the way, and get the RAM seated as well, because those are two things that we just kind of wanna get out of the way so we can start to hook all the other things up. All right, so here we are, we've got our M.2. Now this is a PCIe Gen 3 M.2, which is gonna work for this particular motherboard. Of course, we have newer versions with newer systems that will work and will give you faster speeds, but this should be totally fine for what we're looking for here. All right, so we're gonna go ahead and slide the M.2 into place. Now, a couple things. One, we wanna make sure that we slot it in at a bit of an angle, maybe like a 45-degree angle. Also, we have a very tiny M.2 screw, which I don't even know if you can see here, but a very small screw that's gonna help tie or screw the other side down. So we'll slot this in first, again, at a bit of an angle, and then once that's in place, you'll just feel that slide into place. You press the other side down, and then you'll notice here that there is a screw hole. So we're going to take this very, very tiny M.2 screw. Super easy to lose. That's why you get a magnetic screwdriver. And we're going to just put that right into place so we can hold down the other side here. And again, make sure you don't screw things down too tightly. We just want it to hold it in place. We don't need to crush anything or, you know, break any of these really delicate pieces. So now we've got our CPU fan, case fans, M.2 hard drive in place. Now we're going to go ahead and slot in our RAM. And again, going with that 16 gigs of DDR4 3200, which is tried and true, has served me really well. I did package that back up, so I'm gonna go ahead and get that out of the case here. And RAM is one of the easiest things to upgrade. So if you ever did want to upgrade from 16 to 32 gigs, or what have you, it's super easy to do, and it's also pretty cheap at this point. So let's go ahead and get this in place. Now, another thing you want to keep in mind is that when it comes to putting your RAM in place, you don't just pick random slots to throw it into. You do want to consult your motherboard to see which slots the RAM's supposed to go into. Generally, it's going to be slots 2 and 4 if you have a 4-slot RAM situation on your motherboard, but make sure you consult your guide on that to make sure you're using the right ones. I just happen to know that it's slots 2 and 4. Also, your RAM is going to be keyed, so you'll notice there's a little notch in kind of the teeth of the RAM, and that is going to be ever so slightly offset, so it's not dead center. So you want to make sure that that is lining up with the notch in the RAM slots, so that way you don't have it backwards. If you try to put it in backwards, it just won't work, and if you try to force it, you will break it. So make sure you line it up correctly, and then press down until you hear the RAM click into place. So let's go ahead and do that for both slots. And once you have it lined up, you just press down, and you'll hear a clicking on both sides of it as the latches lock into place. So we've got one. Let's go ahead and do the other. And there we go. That's locked into place as well. Another thing I'll say about RAM, as I mentioned, it is super easy to upgrade. However, I have this 16 gig kit here. If I just went and bought another 16 gig kit blindly, it might not match up with the RAM I already have. So you do have to be extra diligent about that if you are gonna upgrade it down the road. And honestly, I could do a whole video on that and how it affects your RAM speeds and everything, but just something to keep in mind. It's always better if you are gonna wanna go with more RAM, just go ahead and get it up front, get a specific 32 gig kit or 64 gig kit or whatever you want. You can upgrade it later, it just might be a little tricky. Okay, so there we go, our RAM is now in place. We can get that off the table. And from here, we can go ahead and slot our GPU into place. Then we're gonna hook up a few more things. We have all of our front header stuff. So we have our audio from the front header. We have our USB connector as well. So a couple things that will hook up to the motherboard from the front header, but I don't wanna bore you with that. So let's go ahead and get the GPU into place and then I will work on that. And again, for the GPU, we've got the GTX 4060, which is a really great bang for your buck GPU, especially for a build like this. So let me go ahead and open this up and we'll slot that in. Got my handy dandy little knife box cutter thing here. I absolutely love this thing. It's a little Gerber blade that you can swap out different razor blades with it. Super convenient, and especially for things like opening up boxes. If the blade gets gunky or dull or whatever, you can super easily swap it out. So big recommend. Maybe I'll link to this in the description if you guys are looking for a good kind of box cutter, you know, package opener type thing. All right, and we'll take that out. Here we go. Love opening new gear. Zotac Gaming. Love gaming, power the win. Cleaning cloth or something? I don't know what's in here. Oh no, it's the manuals. Okay, cool. Don't really need manuals in this particular case, but that's cool to have. And then of course, here's the actual GPU. Let me just move all these boxes to the side real quick. All right, and we've got our little 4060. Super nice looking. Of course, we got our plastic peel here. We'll take that off. Oh yeah. Love it. Okay, any other plastic that needs to be removed? Just this little piece here. Man, this is nice looking. I like this a lot. All right, very cool. So I've already removed the 2 slots on the very back of the case here. You wanna make sure that you remove those. I believe you will need 2 for this particular GPU. Then you will want to unlatch this portion here, and you should be able to slide this right in. So we'll just kind of line that up. All right, and this should slot right into place. And again, you want to make sure that the teeth on the back of the GPU are lined up with the actual port on the case. And when you press down, it should click right into place there. And now we have a couple of screws here, which I don't know if you can see very well, but those will have to be screwed in to kind of hold this GPU into place. So let's go ahead and grab those and get them locked down. And those will be the same ones that you removed when you took these back like tabs off. So you'll just put that right back into place, kind of securing the GPU for you. Now, thankfully, this is a pretty small and lower profile GPU, so you shouldn't need any additional brackets or anything like that to secure it into place. This should be just enough. All right, and now that is going nowhere. So what I'm gonna go ahead and do here is I'm going to take care of these front panel cables and get them connected to the motherboard. And then I will grab the power supply, get that all hooked up and cable managed, and we'll check back in and see how it goes. All right, so just checking back in real quick. So I just hooked up all the front panel stuff. We had essentially just 3 things to connect. One is the front panel audio or HD audio, which connects at the very bottom here to the JAUD port. That's what it's labeled as on the motherboard. So audio, pretty simple. Then you have the front panel header, which is also connected to a port that says JFP, so FP for front panel. That's right here at the bottom as well. Then we had the USB 3.0 port, which is the big blue one that connects at the bottom as well. The one thing we don't have on this motherboard is a USB-C connector. So unfortunately, I do love that this case has a front panel USB-C connection. This motherboard does not have that ability, so we won't be able to connect that particular plug. I will try to find another motherboard around the same price range that does have a USB-C front header. If I can find one, I will link to that in the description below. Of course, I'm going to link to all the different parts that we use here and any potential replacements that I think might be better or maybe even cheaper. So I'll link to all that in the description. Hopefully that helps out. But now we have everything here connected. I just have to grab the power supply, throw that in, and then connect the few cables that come off of that. And then we can cable manage and be pretty much good to go. Now the power supply that I have here is a semi-modular supply, which is, fine for me, but if you have some case restrictions, you might want to go with a fully modular supply. The semi-modular supplies still have a couple cables kind of permanently connected to them. So that might be something you want to consider. This works totally fine for this particular situation, but just so you know the difference between fully modular and semi-modular, this one does have a couple of cables permanently connected, and then of course the rest you can choose whichever you need for your particular setup. But for here, it should be pretty straightforward, pretty simple. We're gonna use the ones that are already connected, and then we just have one other cable which we'll use to connect to the GPU. So let's go ahead and get that set up. Also, one other thing I should mention here before we get going is that the power supply itself has a fan which will exhaust air out. So you want to make sure that you have that set up facing whatever exhaust port you have on your case. Generally, it's going to be facing the bottom. So it may look funny. It may look like you have your power supply upside down, but that is totally fine and totally normal. You just want to make sure that the fan on the power supply is facing the exhaust or the mesh portion of your case, so that way it's exhausting correctly. Also, another pro tip, don't mount your power supply into the case before hooking everything up to it. I just screwed the power supply into place and I forgot to plug in the GPU cable. So I'm gonna have to remove that, hook up the cable, and put it right back into place. So something to be aware of. An easy enough fix, just annoying. Okay, and so now we have our power supply in place. Again, that was super easy to do, but just something to be aware of. Here is that USB-C cable that we talked about earlier that we don't have a header for. So we're just gonna have to find a way to hide that later on when we do our cable management. Now we have our 24-pin connector, which will go to the motherboard. We have our CPU connector, and we have our GPU connector. Those are all coming from the power supply, and we're gonna find the best way to feed them from the back of the case. This is the back side of the case that we're looking at here, all the way to the front, get those plugged in. I'm not gonna do any cable management yet until I get everything hooked up. Then we will try to test everything out. We'll hook this up to a monitor and a keyboard and mouse, make sure everything works. Then we'll do our cable management once we know for sure that this is all good. So let's go ahead and plug these in real quick. Oh, doctor, and there we go. We've got the PC completely put together here. I went ahead and removed the glass panel so that way you can kind of see the internal components and everything. So as you saw with the build, I did have some case fans already that I was able to install here, but you should be pretty much fine with the fans that come with this case. I just like to have a few extra in there. I had some lying around, so I figured why not use them. And all in all, this is an excellent kind of entry-level PC for someone who's maybe just getting into gaming or who doesn't want to spend a ton of money, but wants to get the best possible performance out of their system. I think you definitely can't go wrong with this. If you have any questions about the build overall, let me know in the comments below. I'll do my best to answer them. Or if you have any experience with this particular setup with these components, let me know that as well. I'd love to know what kind of FPS you're getting in your games. Overall, the build process here was so much more simple than the mini ITX build that I did. It was honestly a dream to work in. So I can highly recommend if you are maybe new to building PCs, this is a great case to go with. So I'm gonna go ahead and get this thing over to the house that it will be staying at for the foreseeable future. And I'll do my best to influence this kid into playing solid games. But that's it for me for this week. Thanks so much for hanging out. I appreciate it. If you enjoyed this video, do me a solid and drop a like on it. And if you wanna see more tech videos just like this, make sure you subscribe. All right, I'll catch you next time in the spare tech room. Be good.